Արցախի հանրապետությունը ենթարկվել է ադրբեջանական զինված ուժերի ագրեսիային.
Fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan has continued.
Nagorno-Karabakh sits within the national boundaries of Azerbaijan but is populated by Armenians and run practically as its own country.
Fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh.
18-19 years sons fighting against Turkish special troops, against ISIS from Syria.
Any Western leader, they could have ended this war in 2 days, but they weren't willing to do that. Whether we live or die doesn't matter. Not all lives are equal, and our lives don't matter. And we've learned that.
How do you feel that no one came to help Armenia?
Anger with all countries, not help Armenia.
So we can hear the drones just detonate.
This nation, didn't spill so much blood just to give it up in an eyelash.
Still a massive amount of confusion on what is actually going on here.
It's confusing to know if we've won or lost.
Putin announced that just short of 2,000 Russian peacekeeping troops will be heading in to replace Armenian soldiers.
People actually thought we were going to win this war, and we were not going to win this war the way it went.
Not easy to burn your home.
Drones, cannons, you name it, they were just constantly coming.
My name is Harak Kitsinian. I'm the chair of the National Armenian Law Students Association. And on behalf of NALSA and the Armenian Bar Association, I'd like to welcome you. I'd like to also thank our speaker, documentarian Emile Ghessen, for joining us today. I'd like to thank Danny and the Armenian Law Students Association for putting this event forward and putting it together. It is a pivotal issue that has been absolutely so important and engulfing the lives of all of us as Armenians, and taking, and I hope more so, the international community is learning about what happened to us starting last September. Before we continue with our program and I invite Danny to speak, just some housekeeping issues, because for anybody who joined us after the trailer started, as you can see, we had some technical difficulties. If you could just keep your mic muted. At the end of the program, after Emile speaks, if we have some time, we'll take some questions at the conclusion of the presentation. I'd like to also share the Facebook page of the National Armenian Law Students Association's Facebook page in the chat. I will put that shortly. If you have any questions for us or the Armenian Bar Association, I'm also going to likewise put their contact information in the chat. I'd like to let present students know that to sign up for our distributions list, we're going to be having, moving forward, a targeted email list specifically geared for ALSA members. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel Malki to continue on introducing Emile.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Harag, and thank you to the Armenian Bar Association for publicizing this special event. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming to today to learn about the war in Artsakh with Mr. Emile Ghessen. My name is Daniel Malki, and I will be hosting and mediating today's discussion. I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Emile Ghessen for taking the time out of his obviously busy schedule while creating his upcoming documentary, as you just saw, 45 Days, The Fight for a Nation, to come speak to us about his experiences through his distinct individualized perspective while on the front lines during the war in Artsakh. And even if you curse your fate, in your eyes, I can see Armenia, a light of hope, a flame, a desire. to take your destiny into your hands head on. Charles Aznavour. I speak to each of you today in solidarity and united as one, that the Armenian people will never be silenced. Even when the world is in silence, the world will fail to obliterate the memory of the eradication of the Armenian people throughout its history and even now. As we all know, in the early morning of September 27, 2020, Azerbaijan launched a large-scale air artillery strike to the Artsakh and the Azerbaijani contact line. There were numerous civilian settlements and infrastructure destroyed, including the capital of Stepanakert in Artsakh. Additionally, thousands of young soldiers perished fighting for the country, as well as many civilian casualties. For 30 years, Armenians have peacefully prospered while living in the free and independent Republic of Artsakh since its independence in the early 1990s. So we are here today with Mr. Ghessen, who gave and is giving people a front seat to the brutal 44-day war in Artsakh. He's a former Royal Marines commando, a British journalist, and filmmaker who risked his life to spend time on the front lines with the soldiers to tell their stories. When the world turned a blind eye, Emile was one of the few voices giving the world a real bird's eye view of the injustices perpetuated in Artsakh. So before we begin, as we watched in the beginning, Mr. Emile Ghessen is releasing an upcoming documentary. If you would like to contribute to the making of the documentary, I will provide the link in this chat at the end of the discussion, as well as all other relevant links related to Emile. So, without further ado, Emile, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys.
Thank you for coming. So if you could please tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about your documentary that we just saw, 45 Days, The Fight for a Nation.
Yeah, so as you explained there, I'm British. I'm a former Royal Marine Commando. I served 12 years. I joined in 2000 and served up to 2012. Very busy time because 9/11 happened. So then we were catapulted. I was one of the first troops into Afghanistan, up in the mountains of Pakistan and Afghanistan, looking for Bin Laden, destroying the Taliban and Al-Qaeda training camps. And from there moved on to an invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then went back to Afghanistan for several tours of Helmand province, where the British, we took over the southern sector, working alongside our counterparts, the Americans, on several occasions. So yeah, I had a quite colourful military career. It was a busy career, all frontline active duty. So I left in 2012 and went into the security industry and consultancy work, bodyguarding work, anti-piracy work. And then in 2014, because my father's a Christian Syrian from Damascus who moved to the UK in the 70s, and my mother's British, is the war against Islamic State was in full swing in Syria. And not only that, is Saudi Arabia, Turkey, America, the UK were funding rebels, so-called rebels, which we all know, anyone who's got a bit of an education, that these people are terrorists, to destabilize Syria. And the war against Islamic State was quite a brutal war. So I met a guy who was in the UK, he was a former sailor, who was going out to Kurdistan in the north to fight with the Kurds against Islamic State. And I found it quite interesting. The fact is that this man was a sailor. I'm a former commando, so I've got the skills to fight, but I didn't feel the urge to go and fight. So yeah, and then he was telling me about a group of people going out, Americans and Brits, to take up arms. And I just thought it's a brilliant idea to make a documentary. I had no previous experience. So I was speaking to a TV company in the UK who were very keen, very excited about it. And then 2 days before we were supposed to start filming, they pulled out for the security, the danger. They didn't understand the access that we had. So I literally went on eBay, bought a $900 camera, read the instructions on the plane and flew out to Iraq and then traveled into Syria. And I've done that for about a year and a half, 2 years, back and forth, 6 trips. I also went up into the mountains with the Peshmerga into Iran, who were fighting against the Iranians up there, just covering what motivates these men to go pick up arms to fight. So that was my first documentary feature. And then after that, I did a documentary feature. I went to film school. And then after that, I went to the Ukraine to then cover volunteer fighters that were taking up arms against the pro-Russian separatists in the frontline areas there. So when the war happened here between Azerbaijan and Armenia, everything I do is self-funded. I'm totally independent. And a lot of people were saying to me, you're going to go out to cover the war. And to be honest, I didn't really know much about Armenia at the time. And I was reading up about the 2016 war, and it lasted only a few days. And I thought, by the time I pack my bag, get to the airport and get myself out there, the war will probably be over. So a week went by, and then I could see the escalation of what was happening here. I could see the escalation of the drone warfare, which was very new tactics, in the sense that drones have been around for years. We've used drones quite effectively in the British military, but we haven't seen large-scale, low-budget drones that we were seeing here that were supplied by Turkey and Israel. And I saw a repeat happen in Syria, in the sense that the Western media were controlling, were very restrictive on their narrative, because obviously people lobbying, obviously funding. So I had to pick a side, and I picked the side if it was going to be Armenia or Azerbaijan. I'm going to cover the war from. And the reason I chose Armenia, one, is because, like I said, my first documentary with the Kurds is the Turks see Kurds as terrorists. So I was getting a lot of backlash for that documentary from the Turks, calling me a terrorist sympathizer because I was filming with the Kurds. And a lot of Turks don't really understand the sense that as a documentary filmmaker, a journalist, you can tell people's stories. It doesn't mean you support their story. It doesn't mean you support their agenda. You're just giving them a voice. So really, Turkey is the second most dangerous country in the world for journalists. So I took the decision to come to Armenia because Armenia were more open to freedom of information, freedom of press, which we'll go into a little bit later on actually about that. So yeah, I came to Armenia in early October, didn't know what I was getting involved in, tried to get the paperwork. They were restricting me to get the paperwork. I finally got the paperwork, got to Stepanakert, and then from there, that's where the journey started. So I was there for 2 weeks originally, then I left. So I had another job on, and then returned, came back, and now this is my 4th trip here now. So we're now currently in post-production of the documentary. And many people ask me why 45 days rather than 44 days, because the war was actually 44 days. And yeah, I know that. One 45 day on the 45th is the 10th of November. So the 45th day is the most crucial day. That was the signing of the agreement. That's when the Russians moved in. So really, for the history of Armenia, the 45 days, the 45th day is the most important day out of all them days. So yeah, we know that the fighting was 44 days long, but 45th day, and that's why we went for the title 45 days. And not only that, it generally gets people talking, because people want to be smart asses and they want to start talking and say, oh, it's only 44 days, do you not know? And it's like, yeah, of course we know, but this is why we're talking, and we've now got your attention. So really, yeah, the 45th day is a very important day, and especially because on the 45th day, I actually went in with the Russians as they crossed the border. So that'll be highlighted in the documentary with the footage we've got of moving in with the Russian peacekeepers.
Well, that's amazing, and we're all excited for the documentary, obviously. And you touched upon why did you come to Armenia during the war? Because it was less restrictive freedom of speech. And you also, as a Royal Commando, you worked, you did stages in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, you're used to the warfare, but what made you particularly stay and document the injustices, throughout the war happening in the Republic of Artsakh?
Yeah, so like I was saying about the mainstream media, I saw it very effectively in Syria, and how the narrative was controlled to suit certain organizations and governments. And I could see a repeat happening here. The fact is that the mainstream media wasn't talking about this war. One, because COVID, the world is busy with COVID. Two, there was the US elections with Trump, which was dominating the media. So when it comes to customers and consumers of news, like all of us are, is the media need to draw a line and go, what do our consumers want to hear about? Do they want to hear about a war in Armenia against Azerbaijan over a disputed territory. Not really. Let's tell them there's a war going on, but let's not go into too much detail. Not only that, is many mainstream companies obviously have more of an influence with Turkey and Azerbaijan than they do Armenia. So we saw that with large news organizations that spent their time in Azerbaijan rather than actually reporting from the Armenian side. But that comes as well. The fact is that, like I said earlier, we'll speak about it, the Armenians were a pain in the backside in allowing journalists to tell the story that was going on here. I had it even now with our edit process, is the footage I've got during the war is very limited to what I had just after the war, because they were restricting, don't film this, you can't film that, you can't speak to these soldiers, they can't tell you. I'm like, we're making a documentary here for the Armenian perspective, you need to support us in this. And they were very reluctant because they didn't understand how to use media. And the war on the battlefield is fought by soldiers and men, and the information war is just as important. And I've spoken to several officials here in Armenia since who have agreed that they messed up on the information space and how to find information space. And we saw Turkey and Azerbaijan very effectively win the information space. That's generally due down to the money. The fact is they were paying large PR companies to assist them. They were paying for adverts and to get their information out there, and they've done it very successfully, and the Armenians really failed on that, and hopefully that's a learning lesson for them for the future. But yeah, so spending my time in Stepanakert and going to the frontline regions, it just opened my eyes just to see that the resilience of so many civilians that couldn't leave, that were living underground, with the daily bombardment from the air, with the drones, the artillery, the Smerch, the Grad rockets. It was quite relentless for a lot of these civilians. And while the world was silent of what was going on, is the Armenian military weren't just fighting the war against Azerbaijan, like I was saying, they're fighting information war, and they're also fighting COVID. So it was a large scale event that was going on, and it was hindered them what was going on here. But we've documented as much as we can to tell that story. And in the documentary, it's not a political documentary at all. The trailer was a bit shaky because when you do it online, it doesn't come across as well. But yeah, we're trying to tell human stories here. We're not getting involved in the politics. We're not interested in the politics. I'm a British journalist. It's not my place to talk about Armenian politics. And not only that, is the country is currently very divided on their politics, on what's going on. So really, we want to tell a story from the human perspective of not just people from the Karabakh region, is also from the Armenians and the diasporans, because there's definitely three different entities here. There are the people from the Karabakh region, there's the Armenians and the diaspora, who all have a different opinion on what happened. And I think what's very important, which needs addressing, is the secondary trauma that so many Armenians around the world are suffering, especially due to the lack of information, that they didn't really understand what was going on. You know yourself, sleepless nights that you probably all had, worrying about what was going on because no one was giving out that information. And not only that, there was a lot of fake information. So that's what we're going to touch on in the documentary. We're touching on the POWs that are currently still being held. I've got an interview with 2 POWs, and they talk about their mental and their physical torture at the hands of the Azeris. We're talking about people that have lost family members. We've got a father who lost his son, who actually, he was on the front line with him when he died. His son was a soldier. The father volunteered, went to the front line to be with his son because he had a bad feeling. And then, unfortunately, his son and 2 of his friends died. We've got a mother who's lost her husband. And we've got some really emotional sequences in the documentary we're going to touch on. We've got an American diaspora that went to fight and how he got involved. We've got people burning their homes when the regions of Karabakh were handed over, and there was a timeline, and I was there firsthand seeing people packing up their homes. And it's emotional times to see that. I couldn't imagine myself being told, you've got 4 days, get everything you've got, get out of here and leave. And it's like, where do I go? Where? And the moments we've got, which we filmed, which will be showed in the documentary, are going to be very touching for people. So yeah, we're really looking forward to it. We don't have a release date at the moment. We've just spent 4 weeks I'm still in Armenia now, just spent 4 weeks where the editor flew in from the US, the producer flew in. So we're working for 4 weeks here. We're about 70% on the rough cut complete. But once we've done the rough cut, we need to move into, we've got composers going to be composing the music. We then need to go into doing a professional voiceover, sorry, and mixing, color grading, stabilization of all the shots and everything. And then before we know exactly where we're going to distribute it, because at the moment we're still trying to get distribution on how we're going to get this out there. Because the documentary, we don't want this documentary for Armenians. We're not interested in the Armenians watching this, because we know the Armenians will watch it. You're a captured audience. So we're tailoring a documentary to show it, so someone who sits at home who doesn't know anything about Armenia can sit down, and in 90 minutes, it's a feature documentary, so it's going to be around that 87-minute mark. 87 with round credits, probably about 90 minutes. So we're going to get people, we want people who don't know anything about what happened here, an hour and a half later to walk away and go, I know something I didn't know 90 minutes ago. And now I understand what's happened in that region and the world, which I probably didn't know about. So that's who our target audience is. Our target audience are non-Armenians. And that's how we've got to cater it, which is very hard in the sense that this isn't a propaganda documentary. This isn't a documentary on me fanboying Armenians to go, oh, look how great Armenia is. It's not that. That's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to produce a bit of propaganda. We're trying to be as objective as we can, but showing it through the Armenian perspective. And that's hopefully what we're going to do.
Wow. Well, there was a lot to unravel there with, I have so many questions regarding what you stated, but I mean, I noticed, you saying that, the Azeri and the Turkish government, they wanted to discredit you because, you are speaking against the mainstream media. And like you said, the norm, which is sad because you were providing actual facts, actual tangible evidence of what happened. I mean, did the Turkish and/or Azeri government, try to threaten or conceal your projects in any way, like you stated? Like, what are some examples of any difficulty you faced?
No, but to be honest, with the online, anyone who's Armenian knows about the online trolls that you get for the Azeri and the Turkish trolls. Since day one, I've just literally blocked people straight away. I haven't engaged to feed the algorithm. So many Armenians have been debating with these people online, and it's like every time you message them, every time you interact with them, you feed that algorithm. The algorithm then thinks that people want to hear what they're saying, and it gives them more of a platform. So I've been very lucky in the sense by blocking them straight away that the online trolling has been limited at the moment. I spoke to several people who go, are you going to show it from the Azeri perspective? And I was like, well, no, there's only so much we can show on the screen. However, what I did do is I reached out to the Azerbaijan embassy in London. I said to them, I'm making a documentary from the Armenian perspective, but we would love an interview with you to talk about how you saw the war from the Azerbaijan side. They then sent me an email back saying they've been monitoring what I've been doing. They don't think I'm objective in the work I'm doing, and they don't support what I'm doing, so they refused to give me an interview. And they also reminded me that I broke international law by going into Nagorno-Karabakh illegally from the Armenian side. So they said they'll answer questions on paper, but they won't give an interview. So I then asked them, are you threatening me in the sense saying that I'll be detained if I was to ever go to Azerbaijan or Turkey? To which they replied, well, we're not saying that, but you have broken the international law. So yeah, they haven't been open to discuss. And that's just the case. And a lot of people saying to me, oh, why aren't you doing a documentary? Why aren't you showing their perspective? And I'm like, there's no one stopping anyone else doing that. Anyone can go make a documentary. Do you mean just get off your ass and go out and do it? So if someone wants to tell the story, which they have done, they've done a short couple of documentaries, the Azeris, but like I was saying, this is a humanization perspective. It's not about politics and what's happened here.
And I'm sure we've all faced the constant taunting and lying, via Instagram, via Facebook, any online platforms that, the Azeris and Turks, have sent. Just if you post something simple as in like, go Armenia, or, anything of that sort, just constant taunting, constant spam, death threats, whatever. And I'm sure you've experienced it a lot more again because you're in the public eye. So, but I wanted to segue into you mentioned your encounters with the brave soldiers. You mentioned the father and son and the mother father and son whose son passed. I wanted to ask you, how were the personal relationships you encountered with the brave soldiers? Can you tell us a little bit about the side of the soldiers' lives that we wouldn't particularly know about?
Yeah, so to begin with, during the war, I was trying to get access to the front line very early on because my background being former commando, going to war zones is what I do. The Armenians kept on saying it's too dangerous, and it got to the stage where, without being arrogant, I had to sit the press office down, the press officer, and say to him, I've probably got more combat experience than 99% of your soldiers currently on the front line, and you're telling me it's dangerous. And I said to them, you're not allowing people like me to tell the story and what's going on here. So people in the world think it's a humanitarian crisis rather than an actual war, because you're not allowing us to do that. And they were like, oh, well, the soldiers don't want to talk to press and all that stuff. And I was like, I knew that was bullshit, because I've seen it everywhere I've gone in the world. Whenever I've turned up with my cameras to speak and tell people's story, they wanted to share their stories because they feel forgotten. So when I actually did, they then decided to let me go to the front line. So once the second I was on the front line, the soldiers were happy to see me. They were happy that someone who wasn't Armenian was interested to hear their story. They were interested to tell their stories so their loved ones can hear what's going on, because many of them didn't have communications with their family, and just life overall. And that I know firsthand that in dark places, a war is a dark place, but at the same time, wherever there's darkness, there's light. And as soon as I met the soldiers, they'd been fighting a few days before that. They're all smiling, they're all telling jokes, they're all drinking tea and coffee and everything. And that's the life of a soldier, is that a lot of people who, especially through my social media, when I'm joking around, are very sarcastic, very dry sense of humor, that some people, mainly people from Los Angeles, let's be honest, who don't have a sense of humor, who are like, why are you disrespecting our soldiers? It's like, well, your soldiers are the ones that are smiling, they're laughing. You're just so far away, you don't know what's going on. These men want their voice told. And even if it is in a horrible, dark place, there's still the resilience of these men, young and old. So yeah, I had a brilliant experience with the soldiers. I had some emotional times with them, especially when after the peace, the so-called peace agreement was signed, in the sense that I went to Shushi and I was with the soldiers as they're pulling out, and it was very emotional to see them just really broken, in the sense that they were like, we wanted to continue fighting, we were winning the battle, we've been told to stop, our hands are tied by the international community, by the Russians, we're giving up our land. And what struck me very hard was the sense that I fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these wars, we were misled in these wars and what we were fighting for. These soldiers were fighting for their land. They were fighting for land that their fathers and their grandfathers fought in the 90s. So seeing many of these younger soldiers, when they were literally broken, in the sense that, and we showed this in the documentary, they were broken because they felt as though they couldn't go home, because they were shamed. They were shamed that their fathers and their grandfathers fought and won, and they lost what their fathers have fought, especially guys who had lost their fathers in the war. So many soldiers I met were worried about going home. And what Armenia really struggles with, because I don't want to use the term they're backwards, but they're just not as developed mentally as the West when it comes to mental health, in the sense that so many of these soldiers returning home now, many of them who were just volunteers and now gone back into society. On the 27th of September, 28th, they signed up, they were given uniforms, given guns, and off they went. And they were never prepared for what they saw. And now the war ended on the 10th of November, and they just were catapulted back into normal society. Many of them still haven't received any money from the government. They're still struggling. They've got post-traumatic stress. They've got survivor's guilt. And there's this massive lack of mental health for these men that return. And it's not just the soldiers returning, it's the families, it's the people that supported them. So there is a definite issue with mental health issues here in Armenia, which needs addressing. And I think that's where the diaspora needs to step in and assist with that, with especially from the United States, who've got the education on mental health and understand what mental health does and how important it is. That I've seen it so many times myself, is that mental injuries are just as bad as physical injuries. And there's so many, I can go out into the city now, into Yerevan, and you walk past every other man probably fought in a war who was there involved in it, or every other woman was involved in some way of helping, but they've never processed what's happened. And I think with the political instability here at the moment, it's just continuing that anger and that trouble mentally for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, you know, I guess the diaspora possibly has to, you know, rethink its role, like you stated, with mental health process. But, you know, I wanted to, you know, touch a little bit on the 9-point declaration. I know you stated Armenian soldiers were utterly shocked, basically, that they were told to stop fighting because they were winning. They were leaving the mountainous terrain. They did not even understand what the peace deal even meant. What were some of the soldiers' remarks you witnessed when interviewing them after the 9-point declaration, which was signed on November 9th? Did they, you stated they felt angry and defeated, but were there any remarks from the soldiers that you got a firsthand look at?
Well, a lot of them, they didn't really understand what was going on because they were on the front line and the information to them was very limited. I remember one soldier saying to me, and he was really upset and really angered about it. And then one thing he did say to me, which touched me really a lot, is that he said, "At least our mothers can sleep tonight knowing that we're coming home." And even though they were angry, frustrated, annoyed, a lot of them, you could sense that they were relieved that the fighting was over. The psychological effect the drones are had in this war is something I've never seen. Is whenever I spoke to soldiers or even civilians about the drones, their face literally drops. And we've got it in the documentary. One of the soldiers saying is the drones were like stars. They didn't know if it was a star or if it was a drone. There was just so many out there. And this is the only reason Azerbaijan won this war, in my opinion, from my military knowledge, is through the drone warfare. They weren't winning the war strategically on the battlefield, toe-to-toe. They'll win it through the air campaign. And of course, you can't turn around and go, well, that's not fair. War's not fair. If a government has spent more money on better weapons, that's so be it. The fact is, you're seeing so many young men who are using AK-74s that was as old as their grandfathers. They were probably used in the 90s war, and they're fighting against drones, the technology on here, that it was a no-brainer that Armenians were always going to lose because they didn't control the skies. And that's any kind of battle. If you don't control the skies, you are definitely limited on the actual on the ground. And the problem we had here, which people saw, is after the agreement was signed, is the weather changed. And even when I'm in Shushi on the 11th of November, the fog had come in, it lingered for about a week. So in essence, if they hadn't signed, the drones wouldn't have been able to fly for about a week. And I think the Armenians would have had the total advantage, especially in the mountain regions. So yeah, just the soldiers as a whole, that just the way they fought here, and just seeing them just going back, and coaches, it was coaches that were taking them back home again. It was coaches that were taking them into the battlefield. It's very primitive in the sense that the way the Armenians, they just weren't prepared for this war at all.
Wow. Well, I mean, military speaking, you're obviously, you're an expert. Do you think the Armenian side held out? I mean, do you think the result would have been any different if, the Armenian side held out?
Yeah, I definitely think if they had held another week or so, the Azeris wouldn't have had the advantage over getting towards Shushi because they were so far logistically. They wouldn't have been able to have overwatch. And like I was saying, the drones were providing overwatch observations. They were also using drones in a very new way, which I haven't seen before, is where they were using drones. Normally, if you call it an artillery or rockets, you generally have someone on the ground to physically see the ground is landing, to then give adjustments, add distance and come left or right to then neutralize the target. What they were doing is they were using drones rather than people for that. So a drone would fly over an area, it would take loads of photos, they then send that message back to the artillery positions. So artillery positions and the rocket positions could launch further behind rather than get closer. And they would use the drone overwatching where the rounds were landed to then move it left, right, up and down. So that's why the drones were such a psychological impact on the soldiers, is because it wasn't just the drones dropping bombs or being a kamikaze drone. They were also calling in rockets and artillery by using that drone warfare. And it's the whole world is, even though the world was silent what happened here, the world were all watching very closely. And I know my friends in the military who's still serving are doing case studies on the war here, and it's just natural. All Western Americans are doing it, the Germans, the French, the Brits. They do case studies of after every conflict and lessons learned. And definitely the drone warfare and how it was used by the Azeris very successfully will go down now as a new tactic for many modern militaries. It was a total game changer.
Definitely. You mentioned, the 9-point declaration was signed basically, I'll just throw up three bullet points. I mean, to stop the shooting, usher in Russian peacekeepers, relinquish control of Armenian held lands. And I mean, you like you were stating, the soldiers felt like they were winning, but it's obviously a great memory to hear, like you stated, where, the soldiers were happy that their mom could finally sleep at night. And, that is heartwarming. And I would always remember that. I wanted to go back and, talk about like the media and, the international political actors. Why do you think that the international political actors, and especially the media, did not pay attention to the injustice in Artsakh?
I think the main issue with the media is, like I was saying, it's a business. All media outlets are businesses, and they want to show it. In order to sell adverts, they need people to watch things on the screen or read their stories to then sell advertisement, and that's simple how the media works. So when it came to 10 stories, they're thinking, do our audience want to hear about what's going on there? Is it in the interest of our audience? And most of them thought no. Secondly, they thought, this is subjective, this is my opinion, clearly. Many of them thought, do we support Armenia, which has got a population of 2 million and a few million around the world that displaced from the genocide many years ago, the diaspora community? Do we pander to tell their story, or do it from the Turks? What do we strategically get more interest from? Is it Turkey or is it Armenia? And very much so, same as what I saw in Syria, is the media pandered to what Turkey wanted because the political pressure that Turkey would put on them. And not only that, you've got to remember, when it comes to the media, there's a lot of private donors, a lot of funding from certain individuals. And Turkey has been very successful at pumping money into media organizations to tell the story and what's going on. And it is very biased. The mainstream media is very biased, and people that think it is objective are totally lying to themselves. Is that they all have an agenda. Of course they have an agenda. We understand that. All you've got to do is look at the big news organizations and look at who owns these. And this is not me as an independent trying to bash the mainstream, because mainstream media does a lot of good work. But at the same time, they are very biased on what they're reporting on. And when it came to Armenia, I don't think they really had an interest in what was going on here in Armenia, because strategically or long-term for their business plan, Armenia really isn't part of their business plan, wherefore Turkey very much is. So rather than actually champion Azerbaijan and Turkey, they're better off just being quiet. And I had it with a TV channel in the UK. I was trying to tell a story about the modern slavery in the Gulf states, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, and in Kuwait. And the news channel who I was dealing with was like, we get a lot of our funding from the Gulf. We don't want to be pissing people off by telling stories that's going to get people a little bit angry here. And this is the way, as an organization, as a business, how the media works. Is, of course, they will go out their way sometimes to call people out for what they were. And the BBC did it when they interviewed the president of Azerbaijan, when they said to him about war crimes. But at the same time, the BBC were very active in Azerbaijan and not active in Armenia. It's like, why are you showing news reports just from one side and not the other side? And me as an independent, I can say that because I didn't have the funding, or I can't physically be in two places at once. Wherefore, organizations like the CNN, BBC, Channel 4, Fox, RT and all that do have the funding to be in two places at one time and tell that story from both sides, but many of them fail to do that. And they were reporting about, let's not be under no illusions here. Let's not lie to ourselves to say that Armenia didn't bomb Ganja and other civilian areas. Yes, they did. They used grads, they used smirch against civilian areas. However, it was more so with Azerbaijan and Armenia, who've done it a lot heavier. So let's not say that Armenia didn't, but when you're going to report it as a mainstream media, don't just show the bombing of Ganja and the deaths of Azerbaijan's soldiers rather than actual Armenian civilians and soldiers on that side. And that's what got me quite annoyed to what's going on, because I could see the recycling of what happened in Syria on just very one-sided reporting. And it's very dangerous when people who don't know anything about the conflict or only seeing one side of the conflict, they then soon form their opinion. And not only that, is the narrative and the rhetoric of that Armenia is an occupying force. Is the Karabakh region since 1920s has been officially Azerbaijan. So when you've got the narrative of that the Armenians are an occupying force, we're going to liberate our lands. People who don't know anything about it go, well, actually, yeah, maybe the Armenians are the bad guys here. Even though ethnically the people are Armenian, they don't know that. They just hear the rhetoric that they're occupying force, they've held on to it, they fought us in the 90s and stuff. And I think where it went wrong was the Karabakh region was never identified as a self-proclaimed state. That's where it went wrong, in the sense that they didn't have their own autonomy of that region. So when it came to the narrative, Azerbaijan were very clever in using that narrative. And like we're seeing now, the prisoners of war, is hundreds of men are still being held by Azerbaijan as prisoners of war. We're 5 months after the war, and what they're doing very cleverly is, well, it's not very cleverly, it's quite obvious what they're doing, but they're not calling them soldiers anymore. They're now referring to them as terrorists. So now the narrative from people who don't know what's going on here and go, oh, Azerbaijan's holding on to Armenian terrorists. No, they're soldiers. They're prisoners of war. And now you're calling them terrorists. So what you do is you now strip away the international community's way of lobbying to get them out. They go, well, they're terrorists against our state. We're going to trial them in the domestic court rather than international court. And it's very clever in the sense what they're doing there with the rhetoric. And it's, once again, it's a manipulation of the narrative.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's pretty sad, given that the media panders, you know, they're biased, obviously, and everyone knows that. They should know that. But, you know, you stated disinformation attacks, you know, are the dissemination of false information with an end goal of basically misleading and even manipulating the public. Are there prime examples of that being a rhetoric in Armenia, maybe such as how you touched on Azerbaijan labeling Armenian prisoner of wars as terrorists to intentionally manipulate the narrative?
Yeah, totally. Like I was saying about the information war and propaganda, throughout history, propaganda has been used in all conflicts, and we now call it disinformation and misinformation. And I think many people don't really understand is in the sense that the way we consume information is very different in this day and age. Before, the mainstream were the gatekeepers to information, wherefore you think about a war, just say even the first Gulf War in 1991, for example, people got their news from reading newspapers and watching the news at 10 or news at 6. That's how they got their information. Now with social media, information and content is everywhere, and that can be exploited in the sense that disinformation and misinformation is very prevalent on your phone, is because we are consumers of information. There's so much information out there for us to consume that most of us don't pay attention. All we do is read a quick headline and scroll past it. I do a lot of guest speaking talking about disinformation, and the majority of people I speak to in this day and age get their news source from social media. And that's a dangerous game when you've got so many people who are getting sound bites online. And not only that, as the Armenians have been their own worst enemy on disinformation. You know yourself as an Armenian is that, like the new museum in Baku, which has recently been opened, how many times has everyone who's an Armenian seen that on their feed? How many people have shared it? And this is just one example of the information that gets spread. I'm just using that as an example, I'm not saying that was disinformation. But what I'm saying is, so many people, which I saw during the war from the Armenian diasporans, who would see a bit of information and they'll share it. They weren't fact checking. They weren't seeing if it was true. They weren't Googling to see other sources or who's talking about it. They were just seeing something online and they'll retweeting it, sharing it on Instagram and Facebook. And it's very dangerous that I saw firsthand that the information war from the Armenians was a hindrance to what was going on here. So it was having a massive impact on the psychological effect on so many people, because people weren't fact checking to see if it was true or not. But at the same time, the Azeris just exploited that. They exploited the fact that people were sharing information, and it doesn't need to be true. And I saw it when I covered the war in Ukraine also, that the Russians were very effective at disinformation on the war in Ukraine, is that by the time we've read the story or a headline, we don't care if it's true or not. We've moved on to the next story. So all they need to do is that they need to just share it the truth, just keep sharing it, a lie. Tell a lie 1,000 times and it soon becomes the truth. People believe that it's true because they've seen it so many times. And very much the Azeris and the Turks exploited that here in this war.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, that leads me to echo that even, you know, now President Aliyev unveiled a trophy museum, you know, which used helmets of fallen soldiers. You know, Azeri authorities also depicted cartoonist Armenian servicemen for display, and then international media still doesn't bat an eye. But what have you seen with even after the war? What have you seen regarding the cartoonist Armenian servicemen, the brave soldiers who died, they're displaying it for the public's view, as well as the trophy museum with the helmets? Have you seen or heard anything regarding that?
Well, no, I've just seen what everyone else has seen, but I think out of everything, the person who had the easiest job in the world were the guys who were commissioned to make the waxworks. Is someone went up to them and go, do the shittest job you possibly can, make them so ugly. And this guy's gone, oh, brilliant, let's make these waxworks really ugly. And it just shows, and it's very like you're saying about the cartoon kind of side of the way, it's very much like how the Nazis did it to portray Jews. It's trying to make them look so people think they are enemies because they look bad. And the Azeris have done this, and most people want to take their kids to Disneyland. I don't know why they want to take them to this grotesque kind of museum. And to be honest, and excuse my language here, but a museum looks really shit. I personally wouldn't want to take my kids there. It's just like, what are you playing at? And to be honest with you, Armenians, I know it's very disrespectful to Armenians, but Armenians should really laugh at it and think that's your mentality. That's how you see it. You've won the war, but you still, at the moment, you've won this war, but you're still gloating rather than actually being respectful to what happened. And I think that's what it comes down to. We talk about the prisoners of war again, is the sense that it's very disrespectful, it's very trying to control the psychological war here now by holding on to these prisoners rather than actually allowing these soldiers to go home to their families. It's a constant with Azerbaijan. And like you said there, the world should be turning around and going, what are you playing at? What are you doing here? You've holding on to these men for 5 months now after war. Let them go to their families. Why are you making this museum? But really, in all fairness, is Azerbaijan can do what they want in Azerbaijan territory. If they want to make a museum, they can make a museum. The international community can't really say much about it. But what people can do, which some people did, is call them out for it and saying, do you really think this is right? Why do you need to have waxworks or really ugly people that actually look like you, that actually look more like Azeris than they do Armenians, to be honest, in my opinion, chained up? Why would you want to take your kids there? So it is very grotesque. And it's that constant psychological warfare that they're still engaging in.
Yeah. I want to circle back to the wounded soldiers. I want to talk. Can you talk about the aftermath of the wounded soldiers? A lot of them, you did lose limbs. I mean, many soldiers were left without a lot, disabled in any way. So, I mean, can you please talk about that, the aftermath?
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of time with soldiers that have been injured that are currently in hospital. And we've got a sequence in the documentary where I go to the hospital, meeting some of these soldiers, talk about their wounds and about what's going on, and it's emotional. And when people watch that sequence of the soldiers, because their faces, they're just so young, they're just young guys, and people, a lot of Armenians were making a point of how young soldiers were in this war, but that's nothing new. I was 18 when I jumped out of a helicopter into Afghanistan looking for bin Laden. All militaries use young men. It's just the nature of the business. So it's nothing new here in Armenia. But when now I'm a lot older and I see these young men, I think, bloody hell, they are young. They are naive. Was I that naive when I was their age, in a sense there? But they're all patriots. They all love Armenia, and they're suffering from their wounds, and the government isn't doing as much as they should be doing financially to help these young men. And like I was saying about the mental health, because even though they've got physical injuries, they've still got their mental health issues that they need addressing here. And there are some people that are doing to help that, but a lot more needs to be done. But yeah, just seeing these soldiers in hospital and just seeing the lack of medical attention that they need, is that so many of these soldiers they had like metal bars and braces that the doctors have put into them and everything. It's like, we wouldn't see that in a hospital in the UK or the United States because our advancement on medical treatment is so much better. But yeah, these young men will be suffering for a long time to come. And not only that, is you've got to bear in mind is what they're going to do next. What do they do after they come out of hospital? Where do they go? Or are they going to go find a job? This is what the government needs to start putting in place is schemes for these people that fought, these soldiers that fought, to go, what's going to happen next for them? How do we enroll them into a tech? How do we get them into, for example, filmmaking or arts or photography, or how do we get them to teach some programming? And that's what they need to start doing. And I think that's where the diaspora can help, is by investing in businesses, especially tech business, to allow and help that these soldiers who fought, give them some way of the future. Because the problem you're going to have here, which I saw with men I fought with, is when they leave the services, what do I do next? That survivor's guilt. And that's when suicide, it starts increasing massively. And we're seeing it from people that served in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's massive amounts of suicide amongst men. It's not just soldiers, but it could be anyone. But what I'm saying is a lot of these soldiers that I think here in Armenia, from the mental health issues, in months and years to come, there's going to be an increase in suicide amongst men who fought during the war if they're not given their help. And I think when it comes to the diaspora, and it's not me finger pointing at the diasporans, because they have done a lot to help, but I think everyone in diaspora helped during the war. The second the war ended, they took their foot off the gas. They're like, oh, well, it was over, we lost. But I think very much this is the time when so many people from the diaspora community should be helping, start looking at how can they help the country to move forward. Because we look at wars, and you look at Japan, look at Germany, they lost of the World War, and they're still very successful countries. And I think Armenia has got a lot of potential here. Even though you've lost the war, the recent war, there's a lot of opportunities in this country. And I think there's a lot of intelligent people here. Labour's cheap, the GDP is very low here, so wages. So for investment wise, I think Armenia is a brilliant choice of a country for people that have got the skills. So definitely, I think a lot of people should look at reinvesting in the country and potentially helping soldiers.
I think, it's very important you touched on what the diaspora could do. I mean, we as Armenians in general, they shouldn't take the Armenian statehood for granted. And the diaspora, they should rethink their role in all the ways you mentioned in support of the homeland and its role as a stakeholder at the table, both politically and economically.
But saying that, what I didn't realize, because I didn't really even, like I was saying, the whole Armenian thing to me is very new since being involved here. And with the diaspora is what I've seen a big part of is diaspora guilt, in the sense that so many people from the diaspora, they've sat around the dinner tables, grown up, listened to their parents and listened to their grandparents' stories. And those that did come to Armenia would come in the summertime for the parties and stuff like that. So when the war started, they felt so distant, and it's like, how do I help? What can we do? And so I think the diaspora guilt is massive. And like I was saying about the secondary trauma from so many people around the world, that needs addressing as well, because people we didn't help, we didn't do what we should have done, we lost the war. And it would be very different if Armenia had won the war. Of course it would. But I think, even amongst the diaspora, I don't want to keep going on about mental health, but I think a lot of people still need to address that, because the inter-trauma, generational trauma that so many Armenians I've seen firsthand have, dating back to 1915. And that's something that was, to me, was a real eye-opener to see, especially when the soldiers and the people that I met during the war were like, we're doing this so we don't have a repeat of 1915. And when you hear a soldier saying that, I'm standing here and I'm prepared to die here because I don't want my parents or my grandparents to be murdered like they were in 1915, that, I mean, it hits home just the reality of what people were fighting for here. And it's not like me fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's very different that these people were here fighting because they were fighting for their existence, and very much so. And I think if maybe a lot of people go, well, what if Pashinyan had given up Artsakh before the war even started, just given it to them? And he goes, but when would it have stopped? Where would the line be now? So yeah, definitely there's lots of people did see that a second genocide was potentially going to happen. And that's why so many men got onto them buses and onto them coaches to go to the front line to stand and fight, because it meant something to them.
I mean, experiencing it and being going through the stories and what I've seen online on social media, it's just, it was tough for all Armenians. I mean, speaking to you, it's hard for me to even ask these questions because they're dear to my heart as well. But I mean, this may have been a sad halt, maybe a loss in the short term, but I believe in the long term, it may have been the single most important catalyst for the Armenian nation to basically reinvigorate themselves and reassess its national goals and ideals. And you mentioned that very well. I wanted to go back and I have you on Instagram. I've seen your stories, and I've been following you for quite a while. So I recall you posting a video of residents of Artsakh driving out of Artsakh on the highway in mass quantities, as well as residents burning down their homes. So I mean, what were some conversations with the local residents that you would like to share with us about them leaving and burning down and destroying their homes?
Yeah, so that, like I mentioned earlier, is very touching to see people. Like, imagine, like I was saying, I couldn't imagine getting told to pack up and move. It's like, where do I move? Where do I go? Well, this is my livelihood. And it's not only just their homes, it's their communities, it's their livelihoods, it's their jobs and everything. That's what they were giving up. It weren't just their homes, and that's the danger we had here. And seeing people set the fire. In the documentary I've got the drone footage of the mass exodus of thousands of cars that physically can't leave because they're stuck. There's so many people. We've got some beautiful footage of that. And it's not me trying to like make it more dramatic than what it is, but the footage that we've shown to people have gone, this is a repeat of 1915. This is a repeat of the genocide days where you got mass movement of people. The only different, and we even got one guy who says it. He goes, the only difference now is they're leaving in their cars rather than on foot. So this is the stuff that I was fighting with against the press office and then with the military about filming and stuff. I go, this needs to be documented. If we don't show this gets forgotten about. And I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time on so many different occasions to like film and get people's testimonies. And like, yeah, we've got one guy, because like I was saying, it's a documentary about 90 minutes long. There's only so much we can show in that period of time. So we can't show everything we film. We've got so much footage, but we've got one guy who's stood there and he's burning down his grandparents' home. You see it briefly in the trailer. And I'm just stood there and I'm just like, I literally say to him on camera, I go, there's nothing to say, is there? And he's like, what do you say to someone that's burning down their home? And he grew up there as a kid. He remembers his grandparents being there, his family being there. But then it's touching because then on the other side of the road, like 10 minutes later, we've got a guy who's cutting up water bottles to give us all moonshine, and we're all drinking moonshine on the other side of the road, laughing, stood around the fire. And then on the other side of the road, you've got people that's homes are burning. There's the cars that people have got all their kids' toys on the roof and stuff. And it's surreal. And I think, like I was saying about dark, there's light in all darkness, is that even though it was a horrible and emotional thing to see that people of the Karabakh region had given up their homes, there were still some magical moments that people were like, resilience. Once again, it's that word I repeat quite a lot when it comes to Armenians, is the resilience, is that, yeah, this won't define us. We'll move on. We'll come again. We'll survive. It is that survival mentality that we've been through this before. We'll go through it again if we need to. And they do it with a smile on their face, even though it's a very dark place for many people. And since then, I've met many families that now live in Armenia, where they've got 7 kids and they're living in like a shack. And then people are like to me, oh, why they've got 7 kids? They shouldn't have so many kids if they can't afford it. It's like, but these people used to have a farm. They used to have as much land as they needed. Now they don't have that land anymore because it's been signed over in the agreement. So they're now having to find jobs and just restart their life again. And like I was saying, you and I, we couldn't imagine tomorrow not going into work. Imagine tomorrow that you don't have your home to go to. We can't imagine that. And this is the story we want to tell in 45 days. Is to a non-Armenian audience, to show them, go, this is what's just happened. When you're sat at home hiding from COVID, this was going on the ground, thousands of miles away, that you didn't even hear about. They're the stories we want to tell. And that's why it's so important to tell this story, so people realize that while, like you're saying, the world was hiding because there's fear of COVID, these people are packing up their homes, and most of them are setting fire to it. Yeah, so really touching moments that we've got, and that's what we want to do in the documentary, show these moments that otherwise would go forgotten. I
can't even imagine, given the whole global pandemic and a war in the midst of it, they see light through darkness. I mean, resilience, perseverance. they're proper adjectives for people who had to leave where they grew up their whole life. You know, the ethnic Armenians, they had to flee areas around Artsakh that were handed.
Same as.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, it's the same as like the cathedral in Shushi. I was there after it had been bombed. It had been hit twice, and they had cleared up all the rubble, and then they were doing a church service there. That the priests were like, "Yeah, it's been bombed here, and it's been hit twice, and we could be hit again, but we're going to continue on praying. We're going to continue allowing people that want to come to then speak." And just be part of, be closer to God. And it's like the moments like that you're seeing, and we touched on that in the documentary as well. It's just like astonishing that the fact is that another missile could come through that roof at any moment, but the priests are like, we will continue. It's like, I could keep using the word emotional, but it's very emotional to see just people, how they just pick themselves up when they fall and just get on with it. And I think so many of us in the Western world, we live in this cotton wool world where we think a little bit of hardship, or someone calls us a name, or we get offended by something, and we're like, it's a meltdown, it's a breakdown. But people are going through some real hardships, and it's not just COVID hardships, it's hardships of life in general, and financial hardships. So people, you can learn a lot of people can learn from the people here, that when they fall, they pick themselves up and they carry on. And I think that is the message across the board here, that we'll try to get across in the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, just the strength that they have, it's unbelievable. I'm living, you know, here where it's nice and sunny always, literally almost 365 days a year, and you know that they have to deal with that. It's bad. But you did mention the church in Shushi, and you posted that you were at two church services, you know, after the church was bombed twice, and your pictures are absolutely breathtaking. Like, you know, they belong on Time magazine or on the front page of any magazine. You know, especially you know, that church, the church that was bombed in Shushi, it was a beautiful moment because of resilience and hope. Because I saw the Armenian priests kneeling down, you know, despite war literally happening outside the church's steps. So I can't even imagine being, you know, in that position of praying, like quietly praying, knowing that, you know, a missile could be literally right outside the church's footsteps. And, you know,
and this is the thing with what happened there in Shushi, is the fact is the church was targeted twice and it went through the same hole. The fact is that the rounds went through the same hole indicates to me that it's GPS, that it wasn't just a random missile. So that was, in my opinion, definitely targeted. Also, what was targeted was the culture center. So the two prominent locations is usually the culture center as well as the church. So they were definitely targeted. And these, I was with a friend here. She's from LA. She's an attorney, and she's been out here documenting all these human rights violations so that they can put together a case to take to an international court. And these are the kind of things that need highlighting to show that it wasn't a mistake. Yeah, I can get one artillery round that's landed on the church, maybe landed in the wrong place, but to target a church and a culture center, they're war crimes in the sense that they are civilian targets and they should be protected. And this is what we're seeing time after time. We're seeing the fact is that the Azeris are that stupid that they're cutting people's heads off and they're filming it and putting it on TikTok and Instagram themselves. Is like, how stupid do you want to be? That the fact is that these are war crimes and you're documenting your own war crimes here because you think it's funny and you think you're that exempt from persecution of future down the line. This is where the international community, this is where the UN, this is where NATO and the EU, everyone's just step in and go, well, hold on a second, what's actually gone on here? How do we address this so it doesn't happen again? When you've got Azeri soldiers with flags on their arms, got an old man on the floor and they're removing his head with a knife, it's disgusting. This is what we were seeing. This is what we were fighting against in Afghanistan. This is what we were fighting against in Syria with Islamic State and the Free Syrian Army. Is why were they getting away with it, and how are they still getting away with it? And I think this is where people need, hopefully, work like our documentary, which we touch on it. They can highlight it to go, actually, yeah, what is being done about this? Who are these people going to be held accountable for their actions? Because that's the problem. Is, and organizations like yourself is, how do you hold people accountable? How do you get them into an international court to then trial these people for war crimes? Because so many war crimes have taken place in this war. And if they're not mentioned, if they're not pursued, they just get forgotten about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you definitely mentioned war crimes, they should be highlighted. You're going to highlight them in a human-like way, you know, in an individualized perspective. So I mean, you know, the people, you know, of Armenia need to be brought out of the deep depression and grief. In my opinion, they are endued the loss of the war, you know, the loss of a part of Artsakh, and in many cases, the loss or injury of loved ones. And, you know, they need to be led towards hope, towards brighter days, towards confidence in their safety and their statehood. But, you know, given all that has happened, you did touch upon this, but, you know, what are your thoughts on the future outlook on Artsakh and its independence?
Yeah, that's a good question. The fact is that the Russians have committed themselves to 5 years there. Is on the road through the Lachin corridor, the Russians have now built permanent bases. They're now taken over Stepanivka Air Base as a logistics hub. In my opinion, the Russians aren't going anywhere. The Russians, I can't see after 5 years going, let's go. The problem you've got in Sunik as well, where the road down from Goris to Kapan, as it goes in and out of the border, is now you've got literally a checkpoint of Armenians. 200 yards, you've got the Azeris, another 100 yards, you've got the Russians, and that goes on for quite a lot along there. There's a lot of tension in that region there. The only thing that's stopping the Azeris from pushing further is the Russian peacekeepers. So I don't see after 5 years that the Russians are going to leave, because the Russians are going to see it as, if we do go, there's potentially going to be another war. So it's in the interest of well, not in the interest of the Azeris or Turks, but in the interest of the people from the Karabakh region to have the Russians remain there. And it's one of them things is, once the Russians are in, do they ever leave? It's like the Brits and Americans, this is our 20-year anniversary into Afghanistan. And there's only now President Biden talk about bringing troops home. It's 20 years. And we went there even though we went to fight, we were doing a lot of peacekeeping as well to a certain degree. But are the Russians going to leave after 5 years? I very much doubt it. They're going to be using it as their new base. Will there be an independent referendum of the region? I very much doubt it, because I think that would then incite the Turks and the Azeris to get angry, because they see it as Azerbaijan rather than as an independent state. So yeah, I think for the future of that region, it's just going to be Russian peacekeepers just holding the area.
Well, that's I mean, it's good to hear, because, you know, you give some of Artsakh, you would think they would take more and more throughout the coming years. Yeah. There would continue to be more war and more bloodshed, and, you know, every 3 years more war, like maybe every. And
this is the thing: is a lot of people are saying about, oh, there's going to be another war. I personally don't think there's going to be a war when the Russians are there. Imagine now geopolitical, the Russians who have gone in. Okay, we send in just over 2,000 peacekeepers troops to this little small area called Nagorno-Karabakh region, and then there's a war starts while the Russian peacekeepers there. On the international stage, people will turn around to Putin and go, well, if you can't control a small region with a population of 150,000 people, how are you going to be on the international stage with your geopolitics around the world? So I don't think the Russians will allow another war. Of course, there's going to be skirmishes. There's going to be incidents across the line where there's going to be fights, and the Russians are going to go, oi, stop. But overall, I don't see that the Russians will allow another war, because if it comes down to a war kicking off and Putin banging their heads together and go, stop the war now, or there's going to be trouble politically from us, I don't think there's going to be another war in that area while the Russians remain there.
Yeah. The Russian peacekeepers being there as part of the November 9th, you know, declaration. But in Aliyev's words and in Erdogan's words, you know, the declaration was to have stopped the war and resolved the conflict. In its essence, is a key to a door, and this is Aliyev's words, in its essence is a key to a door that opens to a wider and bloodier war. And, you know, maybe this is mainstream media talking, but this actually was not. This was Aliyev's words. So, yeah. You know, given that, you know, the enemies have stated these things, what makes you still think, you know, even though they're being Russian peacekeepers, they wouldn't take more and more throughout the coming years?
Yeah, but this is the thing, which I think it's the wait and see game. I think it's all speculation at the moment. So many people are speculating, and especially when it was what month, March, everyone was messaging me going, "There's going to be another war." I was like, "What are you basing this evidence on?" Don't be telling me there's going to be another war because you've seen something on Instagram. Let's be realistic here. But yeah, so.
It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.